Now, today is International Youth Day. However, millions of young people in South Africa are challenged by both unemployment and poverty.
The ailing economy and the rising cost of living continues to be a major concern. Some experts are warning the country is at risk of becoming a failed state.
The latest crime stats paint a grim picture.
The backdrop is a continuing theme of corruption, enrolling blackouts, water shortages, a shaky healthcare system, and myriad other state failures. Others say this is the cost of corruption and negligent leadership. Speak now to research.
Songezo Zibi is a man who's worn many hats over the years. Businessman, journalist, researcher, and now movement leader. He's the founder of both the Rivonia Circle, a non-profit that wants to improve leadership and the quality of policy in the country, and also the founder of one of South Africa's newest political movements, Rise Mzansi, which I'm going to talk to him about today. He is a man that embodies hope for the country and works tirelessly to see a change for the better, and I am incredibly excited to have the opportunity to talk to him today. Hello, Mr. Zibi, how are you doing?
Good, thanks, Gabriel. How are you? Just call me Songezo.
I'm doing very well, thanks, Songezo. So to start, I want to do a little bit of a brief personal history. So where did you grow up?
So I grew up in the Eastern Cape in a place called Mkanduli. It's out near the Wild Coast. That was 47 years ago. I'm 47 years old now, and I spent in fact, all my formative years there. I left to go to boarding school when I was 14 in 1990. My mother still lives there, and the rest of the immediate and extended family still stays there. So it remains home for me. But I now live in Centurion in Gauteng, and I've been here since 2006 at the beginning.
And so I want you to briefly take me through kind of the steps that led you to the point now that you've founded Rise Mzansi. So how did your life lead you to this point?
Look, I think there have been many reasons over the years. I think that brought us here. I think the biggest is just seeing the kind of trouble the country is in. People experience it differently. Some people, and we've got these in all our families, I think some people are poor, they don't have jobs, and they don't have hope specifically, but it's not just that, but it's also communities as a whole not being able to improve. And freedom is nothing without material benefits. And democracy is nothing without material benefits for ordinary people. So the experiment in self-government, if it is to remain credible and stable, it has to lead to a better life. And things have been getting worse for years. And there comes a point where you realize that if we just observe and write and comment, we will become complicit in what the country becomes. And that's what led me and my colleagues to start the Rivonia Circle, and which also led to the Rise Mzansi movement.
So can you briefly explain what the Rivonia Circle was trying to do, and then how it ended up in Rise Mzansi, and what Rise Mzansi is at its current stage?
So there's something we should have done after 1994, and that was to build a democratic culture in South Africa. And that is a culture of democratic participation and therefore democratic accountability. What we have ended up with is a strange procurement of political services from political parties where people generally are passive until something really upsets them. And that formula doesn't quite work because in our system, you also don't get to know who your representative in parliament or in the provincial legislature is. You only vote for a political party, and political parties have enormous power. Now, this mismatch between the democratic ideal and the practice of democracy has given us many problems over the years. The corruption, the unaccountability, the poor performance of the state. But I think most concerning so many people are not voting. About 70% of eligible voters do not vote or didn't vote in 2021 in the local government elections. So Rivonia Circle works with democratization and democratic accountability, but we recognize that that on its own is not a solution. We also, that civic engagement has to lead to the building of solutions, local and national solutions, which is the policy bit. And then the third bit is, if you accept that you need to do that, you also need to worry about, so who is going to implement all of these solutions, which then leads you to the leadership aspect. That leads you to the fourth, which is it possible to bring different stakeholders around the table to agree on some key principles and priorities about how to take the country forward? That, in a nutshell, is what Rivonia Circle is trying to do with those four pillars.
And how does that lead into Rise Mzansi, and what is Rise Mzansi then?
So what happened is, through this process of civic engagement, there's something that kept coming up all the time, which is because of the deep disaffection with political parties and the quality and level of political representation. People kept saying they want to represent themselves, they want to vote for independence, and so on. And this conversation culminated in two workshops, one bigger than the one before. The first had 60 people, the next had 500. And 160 people, the next had 500. And what came out of that is a decision to build a political movement. And the reason I'm saying it was a decision to build is that I personally insisted in that second conference that simply getting together into a room and deciding to form a movement doesn't turn you into one. You need to go out and build one. You need to have a community and regional and special interest organizations affiliating to the principle of building a movement. So it's not just individuals, it is also organizations right across the land on the basis of shared national and local interest to say, we are going to build a movement. And therefore, hopefully in April, we will be able to eventually launch a movement with a broad alliance of organizations from right across the country and call ourselves a political movement that can contest an election.
It's very interesting, and one of the aspects of the conversation that I hope we can bring up maybe a little bit later is to talk about political culture in South Africa, because I've read extensively your writings on the political culture, and it is a passion of mine. And one of the main drivers behind actually this podcast series is to provide some sort of easy engagement to make people aware about the importance of democratic engagement, to figure out, this we need to have a mutual understanding of what politics is like in this country, and what the current political paradigms are, to be able to move it forward. But before we get too far into that, I want to start and push you a little bit on this. So why was it important for Rise Mzansi to be a new political movement? What about the current political system left you thinking that you couldn't have done better work by joining an existing political party?
Politics is about ideas. So let us start at a different place, which is why so many people do not vote for any political party at all. Right? That's a fundamental question that any person professionally engaged in politics has to answer, and the evidence is incontrovertible. People just don't appear to trust political parties. So in making a decision about how to participate in politics, you have to try and understand answers to this question, right? And in our view, political culture has a lot to do with it. What do I mean by that? There is an exchange of promises and commitments between political parties and the electorate, where political parties have over the years said, if you vote for us, this is what we will do for you. We fundamentally believe that it is a superficial way of democratic engagement. It has also led to cynicism because people simply don't believe the promises any longer. If you're in the Eastern Cape and core unemployment is 55%. Well, I mean, and you've been promised things over the last 30 years. If the same political parties come and do so, that's important. We couldn't be part of something that looks like the very thing or part of the very thing people have already rejected. And we must accept that this is what has occurred. If only 30% of people vote for the number of political parties we have, you really have to ask about the 70%. So that was the first thing. The second question is, if you then go into another political party, as I personally explored, can I change its culture and its brand to be what I believe will work? In other words, can you change the nature of the ANC or the Democratic Alliance with branches and leadership and promises and saying we're better than the ANC and so on? In other words, again, procure political services from me, and I promise I will deliver to you. Fundamentally, I believe this is not how you do politics that animates people. To deepen the democracy on the one hand and to bring them back into political activism again, without being rebellious, if you know what I mean. So the way people now engage in politics is to try and burn something because they're frustrated, right? Thirdly, and which is the last point, is you see this exchange and what puts people off by offering people membership, saying please join a political party. But the reality is mere membership of the political party doesn't change your life. And people know this. They know it. So they're cynical about it. There are some people who will join, but the rest won't. Even the ANC, which is the biggest political party in the country, has 400,000 members. In a country of 40 million voters, it gets you nowhere. So this is why we ended up with a movement, because we felt over the past year we'd learned enough to do politics differently. And that's why we're not part of a specific political party.
Yeah, and I can imagine that what must be startling for you to have seen, having lived through during your kind of very formative years, lived through the transition to democracy, where, from what I've gathered from speaking to people who are involved in the writing of the Constitution, that the overwhelming sense of hope and optimism for the democracy in the country was there during that time. And now we cut forward almost 30 years, and it seems as though everyone seems to have forgotten what it's like to be hopefully engaged with politics. So to move us then to talking about what Rise Mzansi stands for, what are the core values that join the Rise Mzansi movement together?
So before we get to the values, so maybe let me just talk about the style of politics. So democracy is described as a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And we try and make that really come alive in the sense that we don't offer an exchange of promises and votes. What we are asking for instead is daily engagement at local level with issues of common interest using democratic methods and democratic structures. In other words, we need to work on every problem, however small, every day in every community, right? If that is what we do, that's a kind of politics we encourage. You then have to ask what is then going to bring us together as a set of values to do that. And the first one is the idea of freedom. In our view, it's not just being free from things, it's also being free to do certain things. So to give you an example, are you free from gender discrimination? Sure, but if you're not free to walk in the streets and not be attacked by a man, then you're still not quite free. So freedom has to be real, it has to be realizable and tangible. So that's why freedom is important. The second is justice. And justice really means fairness. It's not just equality before the law. It also means, as Barack Obama says, everybody gets a fair shake in life. Do I get a good opportunity to build a prosperous life for myself and my family? Right? So that is the second thing. The third is solidarity. And solidarity is linked very much to justice. And that is we become a country and a people that refuse to leave anyone behind. In other words, we put our private efforts and public resources into making sure that we create a just society. Now, in the context of policy, that might be sort of be reflected in progressive tax policies and redistribution on the one hand, but also just in terms of how we do some of the things. I mean, do you want to give everybody free education, or do you want to say those who can afford to pay, and those who can't don't have to pay, so that we use both the public and private resources? So in other words, you can go to the same school, but there is a means test that determines how much you pay. And eventually we can have no fee schools for everybody. It's an example, right? So that concept of solidarity. And the last one is equality. And equality in the real sense. In other words, we don't just say we are not sexist. We actually go out to build a society where the genders are equal. Both the subtle and the overt discriminations are gone. But when you go out and try and build a life, you actually can, and these things don't become an obstacle anymore. And so we felt that on the basis of those values, we can build a new politics because it reflects what the South African Constitution is about.
For sure. Um, and so, with related to this, then, what do you think are the current major political issues that the values of Rise Mzansi are geared towards kind of helping? And what do you think that the government focus should be on in the practical sense?
So this is not in order of importance, lest I be accused of not caring about material things. The first one is democratization, it's political reform. We have to improve the way we elect people who represent South Africans, whether that is in parliament or legislatures, which means electoral reform and related arrangements have to change, because the distance you see between ordinary people or voters and political parties is occasioned by a political system that drives a wedge and makes it wider and wider between the people. And so the democracy is central to what we do next. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have to have an economy that is just and inclusive. And what sets Rise Mzansi apart from anybody else is that we recognize the intersections of different disciplines in realizing this. For instance, you have to have a plan for the youngsters who never finished matric, have no skill. You also have to have a plan for reducing the number of youngsters who don't finish matric. And then you have to have a plan for those who've completed matric to get further education and training, so that your labor force is able to support your economic aspirations. We do not go for just fix the economy and everything will be fine, because real life doesn't quite work like that. And we believe that if you do some of these things, you're honest enough to fix some of these basics, you begin to fix inequality. Because the reason our inequality is so bad is because there are so many people who earn nothing. It's not so much that there are too many people who earn a lot, there are too many people who earn nothing. So you need to make sure that at the bottom you've got more people who earn a real living wage, so that you begin to reduce your inequality. It's not going to disappear overnight. But anyway, so the economy and jobs is important. The third one is health. But health is also multidisciplinary. In what way? In that health for us is not just access to health services. Do people have food security, for instance? Not just any food, but food that supports the development of every child, especially in the first 7 years of life, for instance. Are people able to go beyond feeding themselves to being able to make a living out of the food that they produce and so on? Are people able to have clean running water that's potable, that is drinkable? All of those issues contribute to whether you're going to have a healthy population or not, including health services, for instance. So you will see that when I spoke about the economy, I spoke about education too, because it is implicit in what I'm saying. So what I'm trying to say to you, Gabriel, is that we are trying to reorientate the way we think about solutions in South Africa. To say in real life, people don't say, okay, I'm just going to worry about education, but man, I'm hungry, but it doesn't matter right now. I'm just going to be in class. I'm hungry. Like, life doesn't work like that. And we must not shirk from the challenge of finding solutions in that way. Of course, crime and safety is important. Crime and safety are important in the context of realizing freedoms. If you are afraid in your own home, you are not free. If you can't walk the streets or in your community, you are not free. So having safe communities is fundamental to the concept of freedom as we interpret it and as we choose to understand it. So those are some of the priorities we think are important.
I really enjoy this part, how you've laid it out, because I can see that there is a multidisciplinary layered approach that you're coming at these problems with, which I think has been very much lacking. And I think it goes back to the discussion about political culture, because it's very difficult to actually solve a problem by categorizing it into a single box and going after it. So, for example, what I like when you talk about the importance of crime and safety for because it minimizes the amount of freedoms that people can enjoy, because you can't walk on the street and because you can't enjoy being in your community. And for example, one of the things that on this podcast series that I've found is severely lacking in conversations about crime is that everyone says that it's important that we fund the police, we restructure the police, we get the police working to be able to combat crime. But no one talks about the fact that the massive amount of unemployment that we have is a breeding ground for these gangs, that because obviously if there's hundreds of thousands or millions of young people who have nothing to do every day and are on the streets in impoverished communities where they can fall prey to gangsters, the gangsters will be able to recruit a few of them. And so no one was proposing bottom up solutions to these things.
Absolutely.
And so I think that kind of leads us very well into talking about how Rise Mzansi will be approaching some of the bigger problems. So let's narrow down on the economy stuff, because you talked about creating a just and inclusive economy and how education and the economy come together to provide the circumstances for this to happen. So what do you see as the interplay, and what do you see as the most important interventions that are going to start to move us towards a higher growth economy that manages to get people from all skill levels employed across the spectrum?
What is fundamental is health to economic growth. Health is important to economic growth. And what do I mean by that? Let's think about the reason we work to begin with. We work to put food on the table. And I think that is a particularly important goal to pursue, because in that there is existing social and other infrastructure that can be leveraged to improve the lot of people, not just in terms of their own health, but also in terms of economic inclusivity. So let me give an example. South Africa is still, although it's urbanizing fast, is still a largely rural country. People, notwithstanding landlessness, to the extent that we've got a history such as we have, but there are also millions of South Africans who have access to fertile land, which, if we were utilizing certain agricultural methods for micro farming and cooperative enterprises and so on, we can begin to provide food for families, but also food for commercial purposes. You solve two things, three things in that way. The first is people have meaning to their lives and there is dignity. The second thing is that they actually become physically healthy because they have good nutrition. The third is you begin to have the basis for social and individual enterprises that integrate people into the larger national and international economy. as an example. So a high rainfall province like the Eastern Cape, I mean, in my village, lots of families have got more land than people have in kibbutzes in Israel or in Vietnam and that sort of thing, where they use intensive, scientifically proven farming methods, which give people a bit of both. You understand? There's no reason why we can't do these things. So, what am I saying? I'm not saying that this is the only solution that we would work on. I am outlining a principle. The principle is you try and build your solutions around your current realities and what resources you have. You work on the concept of building things around families and communities, for instance, so that the ownership is always yours. Thirdly, is the concept of working very hard to sustain community structures culturally and otherwise, because we have an industrial conception of society, which is people must leave their homes at 6 a.m. and come back at 6 p.m. And then we will say they have a good life. Right? Doesn't quite work that way. I think people need to have an opportunity to be members of the community. And I think if people are able to make a dignified living, they don't necessarily have to make a high income. They merely need to have a sustainable income, right? So I'm just saying this is how you think about economic development in a multifaceted way using the assets that you already have. Obviously, in urban and rural and peri-urban areas, you have appropriate responses. And the kind of training you do is built around the infrastructure that you have and the opportunities that you have in every sense.
And then I want us to talk about education, because I think that this also ties into the idea of democratization, because in essence, to have a democratic citizenship, you almost need to you need to be educated to the level to understand the importance of democracy. And I think I'd love to talk about your democratization in a little bit, but to focus in on education, how are you viewing how the current education system and the current realities of the country could be improved to create an education system that leads to a much better outcomes than we currently are seeing?
I think the first thing we need to do is to change orientation. Our orientation is to produce workers in an industrial society. I think what we should set out is to try and produce wholesome, critically thinking human beings. And that means we do that in the first, so early childhood development. Honestly, if I were to redirect a lot of state resources, it would go towards early childhood education, because I think it is important that every village or every two villages are able to share a really top-notch early childhood development center. I would go as far as giving large companies tax rebates and things to try and accelerate and do this as fast as possible. Because when you have a human being who has been food secure, who is healthy, and has had the kind of stimulation in the first 7 years of life that you need, you have a much better opportunity to create entrepreneurs, to create better politicians, and therefore the outcomes, a sort of in 12 years' time, will be so much better. We talk about how Bill Gates was a dropout and whoever else. Fine, but what we don't think about is that the early childhood development is really critical. And so for me, the first sort of 12, in fact, the first 15 years of life, I would pile a lot of investment into that. And I think that will go a long way towards reshaping our labor market. We've got to be able to have engineers who actually become very successful somewhere else, not as engineers, and vice versa, because people have intellectual optionality in terms of what they can do. That's what really strong early childhood development does.
Mm. And then this kind of moves us in quite nicely to democratization, because we're talking about how do you build, or not, so let's not use build, we're talking about human beings. How do you get human beings to develop in such a way as they can become productive and live meaningful lives, and not in the industrial sense, as you pointed out. And one of the important aspects that you pointed to was community involvement, which in many ways serves as a critical part of your civic learning, because if you learn from how to deal with the problems of your community, you learn actually how to deal with those problems more generally. So because I think it's very often the case that the best political solutions are the ones that are built from the bottom up. And so why is democratization and specifically electoral reform, to reduce the distance to politicians, so important to Rise Mzansi?
Well, it is important because I think we need to regain something that was lost in communities. Earlier this week, I published in a regular column. I remembered or recalled the headman in my village, who really was a fine human being. So people think that a chief or headman is a dictator. They're not. They're both a mediator, but also they try and win the argument intellectually. That's really important, right? And so that is how they lead, because actually they don't have powers to force anybody to do anything really, because that's just not how life works. You only have to get the community to agree. But I learned a couple of things. I learned about consensus, about building consensus, for instance, from that process. I learned about community self-ownership of its own destiny. My school that I went to was largely built by the community. The church was built by the community. Lots of things were done by the community. The fence around the school was done by the community. And when Madiba came out of prison, every family, I think, forked out 50 rand, whatever it was, or 15 rand, I cannot remember. But the concept of people coming together, taking a decision to invest in something that is good for them, is as democratic as they come, even if it doesn't happen in the electoral sense. So this is why democratization is important, because what we then saying in the modern liberal democratic sense is that what you're doing is you're creating a set of professional institutions and processes to make those traditions consistent and fair and transparent. And that is how I believe we need to talk about democratization in South Africa, and not as an electoral thing where you're going to vote for someone and you put all your trust in them and hopefully they're going to do something for you. We breed cynicism.
Mm. And I think I want to linger on this a little bit longer, because from my sense has been, since kind of coming back to South Africa in September of last year and getting engaged in politics properly since then, is that the the way that most people view politics, and what most politicians seem to approach politics, is, as you pointed out, it's a set of promises that people make to the electorate, and then they try their best to, or sometimes they don't even feel like they have to try their best to fulfill those promises. And yet, what you're seeming to suggest is that that kind of way of doing politics isn't actually the democratic way, because what democracy requires on the part of every individual is to be engaged and involved, so that they might be able to offer solutions and help in the ways that they can. Because if you rely on the top to sort out problems from the center and to distribute these problems widely, what you'll end up finding is that solutions that they distribute don't work in your communities, because obviously they don't know what's going on in your communities. And so to be able to have to be able the politicians to be able to even deliver on the promises, you need to have instilled some sort of democratic thinking within citizens, which is, okay, so this is the resources we've been given from the government. How are we going to implement them in the most effective manner in our community? Is that a good kind of summary of what we think of how I should be thinking about how you approach politics?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is correct. But it also teaches people a very important principle that politics doesn't always have to be competitive. Politics should be about solutions and the best ideas that you place on the table, which is why the constant involvement of people in politics, in political decision making, means that outside of an election, we still need to get into a room and have an argument. It's not about who's won and who's lost. We're trying to solve a problem in the community. But I'm hoping that through this part of the conversation, you can see how that links to the ideas of freedom and justice. What do I mean? If you are never in your community because we have not made it possible for people to go to and from work within an hour, for instance, it means there is simply no time to participate meaningfully in democratic processes where you live. And so the idea of justice has to say whether I earn a few million rand a year or I earn 80,000 rand a year. It has to be possible for me to take part in the affairs of my community. And that means how we think about spatial planning and infrastructure and so on has got to facilitate a process in which the democracy thrives. We can also say that the reason food security and health are important for people is because if you're hungry and you are not well as a consequence, you really have little time to engage in democratic action. And so, what I'm trying to say in a way is that to us, these values are interlinked. They don't come one after the other. They're not separate blocks. They really interlinked together so that you build democracy on the one hand, but also you improve life materially on the other.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating way of looking about it. But you mentioned what you're talking about there, infrastructure, and I think it would be a severe omission on our part to not talk a little bit about the infrastructure problems that we're currently facing in South Africa. So, how does the problem of service delivery and infrastructure feed into this kind of holistic system of Rise Mzansi? And how are you going to approach issues such as the massive failure of ESCOM to be able to provide electricity?
So again, I see infrastructure as an object of two things or two outcomes that we're looking for. So the first one is justice, and the second one is freedom. Again, so what do I mean by that? I think with justice, you make certain decisions about what is the most important infrastructure for realizing basic human dignities. Water falls into that. Water falls into that category. Access to electricity falls into that category, and so on. Now that's one. What do I mean by freedom? What I mean by freedom is that you don't just think about building a road that is safe, that where taxis can ferry people to and from work, but you also think differently about the concept of public transport. And public transport should not be private transportation used by the public on these roads. So, in other words, you think of infrastructure broadly. It's not just the road. The train is part of the infrastructure. The bus is part of the infrastructure, and so on, right? If we think of things that way, we begin to break down some ideological dogmas. For instance, do I want to insist that the government should provide electricity to ordinary people? Or do I want to say you want every home to have rooftop solar so that people can fulfill their basic energy needs? And over time, it's actually free of charge. It reduces what? Their cost of living. And if you reduce their cost of living, you begin to enable investment in other areas of their lives. When you think of things that way, you not just thinking about how to solve the electricity problem. You're building things around the family and the community. Again, that is one example. The second example I would take in terms of infrastructure is water, which is critical to health and food security, the development of the human being, and so on. And therefore, you ask yourself, what is a just way of doing things? And I think that's what policies use then to say, if we make a habit of overpaying for things, then we're not creating a just society, because it means the limited resources we have don't go far enough in making sure that other people have got access to justice and freedom in the way that we do. Now, all of this might sound very abstract, but it helps me to have a moral reason for everything that you do on a technocratic basis. It gives you a different measure. It's not whether I completed that road in time. That's important. But what has been the impact of that road on the people that live there?
Yeah, I think in some ways it is abstract, but in other ways it's very practical, because people don't we don't talk about the reasons why we want the things we want, and it's very important to get to the bottom of why we want the things we want, and why we say we need some of the things we say we need. And because if we have our priorities straight, then we can use, as you pointed out, we can use the limited resources that we all have to actually affect the most amount of change. If we don't have our priorities in the right place, this simply won't happen. We will bounce from issue to issue on whatever seems like the most important in the moment, and we won't be grounded in anything long term. Um, and so I'm getting a very strong sense of the fact that the long term matters to you, not just the short term. Like how is it that we build a solid foundation through from which everything this country can become prosperous, not just for now, but for as long as we possibly can be. Um, and I'm wondering, how did you come to this kind of um, idea, and when what in politics could maybe use the most long-term planning as the system currently exists?
So I think uh, for me it comes from a very realist sense of what it will take to make things better in South Africa. So I've asked myself, and with my colleagues as well, if we see a new society as only a series of bureaucratic actions, can we really resolve the problems we have within a generation? Because that's also important. I think having goals with no time targets, is also a recipe for just never getting there. And I think that question leads you to think of qualitative measures that would tell you whether you have begun to deliver or not. Hope is a qualitative measure, right? People are hopeless right now. What delivers hope and optimism to people? That's a qualitative measure. It sounds abstract, but it begins to guide you in terms of what you prioritize, and so on. Secondly, it makes it possible for us to not be overwhelmed by the enormity of the task before us. Because if you only think narrowly about what the government can do within its resources, all of us will sit back and say, this stuff cannot be done. But when you take an all of society approach, where you make a commitment to leverage both private, public, and community resources, right, to make life better for everyone, then you begin together. Let me give you an example. When I was growing up, not every family had all the farm implements, but the community would make sure that collectively there's like enough of the different farm implements that you need. And so when people came to borrow a farm implement, whether it's a plow or whatever, they would say, we've come to exchange a plow. It's not a direct exchange, but what it does is, if you lend me your plow, I'll lend you something else one day because I've got something too. But can I use yours in the meantime? Now that's fairness, that's solidarity, right? But you can translate these into actions, actually real daily actions that people can do. And personally, for me, given that it's going to take so long to solve some of these things, the idea of every South Africans trying to help out every other South Africans alongside the government is very exciting. for me. It says we can get so many more things done a lot quicker than we think.
And it's very interesting that you have that opinion. And maybe a good question to ask on this is, what did your time, because you've spent most of your life in the private sector, what has that taught you about government?
So what is taught is not so much about government, it's about the challenges of governing. Okay? And the first one is that capacity is really important, right? If you don't have the ability to think creatively around these problems, you're not you're not gonna solve it, right? And so creativity and capacity for innovation becomes really important. And I think there is so much rigidity in government and in politics that sometimes people don't see solutions staring them in the face. I've learned that over the years because I've seen both the positive and the negative that has come out of one or other situation. So the Utnake and Port Elizabeth areas were transformed by the Motor Industry Development Plan. But in that, the communities, the motor companies, the component companies, the unions, and the government each had a role to play. And they grew opportunity and quality of life exponentially in that area. You can see where that happens. But then you go on to mining, where the thing has been gridlocked for years, investment has fallen, and. So same government, same problem, different solutions. One is innovative and effective and has got a real material impact on people's lives. The other one heads in the wrong direction. So there are some of the lessons that I learned. In mining, as a final example, there's something called the social and labor plans, where mining companies are expected to do community work. Now, I felt that if you're to take the motor industry example, where the motor company is committed to doing certain things and plowing money into certain things, which is going to result in greater tax revenues and more training opportunities and so on. You don't need to ask them to do certain extra things the government should be doing because everybody puts their shoulder to the wheel, right? I just feel that the experience I've had has informed how I think about solutions. And I feel that the bottom up approach in terms of how you think about the problem and how you begin to implement solutions is also important, as long as your systems are really solid.
Yeah, I agree. And so the role of government then is to make sure that the systems are solid so that when the solutions come from the bottom up, they are effective at alleviating the problems.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so, our last kind of practical area that I'd like to linger on before we kind of turn our attention towards 2024 and what that will represent for Rise Mzansi is something that you brought up right in the beginning. It's safety and security and crime. Um, and so I'm wondering, to in a more practical sense, how do we start to reduce the horrific nature of crime in this country? You know, it, we need to bring down the murder rate, hopefully to below that of Mexico again, at least, and then keep it falling from there. We need to we have we have some of the rape capitals of the world, and that's not anything that we should be proud of. How do we eliminate and begin to alleviate problems like this?
So I think a systematic bottom-up approach again is important, focusing on prevention in the main, right? In other words, how can we stop more people from engaging in crime? There are short, medium, and long-term solutions to that. In the short term, there is what we can empower families and communities to do, right? Among the key drivers of crime, right, in each community. So, for instance, if like I was in Mtanzania last week, and let me answer this question with this case study. So I was in Mtanzania last week in the Eastern Cape, and the community is complaining about crime, break-ins, drugs, and so on. And the conversation very quickly goes towards foreigners and the role that they play. And so we say, okay, guys, we're going to try and tackle this problem in maybe 4 or 5 different chunks. The first is that some of you are going to find out and track all the places where drugs can be obtained. So that's one lot of people, right? You need to have a list of everybody who's selling drugs in the community. So that's the one area. The second is some of you, and this is not in any order of importance. The second, you need to decide who's going to think about a drug and dropout prevention in the community. How do you understand the drivers of all of those? These kids that you call amapara and drug addicted and that sort of thing. So what needs to be done and what kind of support do you need in order to do that? So that's the second one. The third is about how do you prevent most of the petty crime that happens. What system do we build in the community, working together with the police and so on? And fourthly, how do we help the police catch the most and convict the most problematic criminals in the community? So we end up with these 4 things. And the idea is you work together as a group, but everybody has got their own area. And when you meet and you engage, you're engaging with the problem systematically. Of course, the 5th one, which I forgot just now, was rehabilitation. Because the point I was making was, if you chase away all the foreign drug dealers, they're going to be replaced by local ones. It doesn't solve your problem. So we need to deal with this issue. And ordinary people understand these things. They're not stupid. They got it. They're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now they know who's going to do what. And therefore, how do you engage with different authorities? The police, the social development, the health authorities, Department of Labor, and. Now, the mere existence of a solution gives the community hope. Right? If a potential solution is not perfect, but in 20 minutes, we could start to fashion a solution out of that conversation.
Yeah, that's incredibly it's incredibly empowering, and it also speaks to the thread that's run through our conversation the whole time, which is we need to encourage people to engage in their communities, because a solution like that is only possible if all aspects of the community can come together to coordinate, of course, and you only get that, as we've been talking about, by having people engage. And so I can see how how your thinking has kind of has led you to the way that you approach problems, and how they all come in this systematized and coherent manner, which is incredibly fascinating, and it truly is a reflection of the fact that you are bringing something different into South African politics. And to use this kind of energy that I'm drawing from this fascinating conversation, I want to talk about the top for a second, which is what is going to happen in 2024. And from the research that I've done in the Social Research Foundation, what the research around the rest of the country seems to indicate is that South Africa is moving to a coalition government at the national level in the next election.
Absolutely.
We need to get to grips with some of the potential coalitions that could come down the pipeline. But before we get into Rise Mzansi's stance on potential coalition partners, I want to ask you, what is the way that you're viewing coalition making going into 2024?
So I'm viewing coalition making as having 2 stages. Stage 1 is the pre-election coalition, which is a broad coalition of different stakeholders and partners in society coalescing around a set of values and priorities. And that is why we're talking a lot about values, right? So that what brings people together is not so much who the leader is. That's important. It's not so much who the personality of the leader, but what brings us together as a people. I think the pre-election coalition, especially in the next election, is particularly important because In a coalition arrangement post 2024, it's going to become very difficult to have a discernible political center, which a country needs in order to have national consensus. So rather try and build a lot of that consensus ahead of the election and unify as many organizations and stakeholders that share the same values and the same vision as possible, so that you've got far less disintegration or fragmentation post-election when you now need to have a governing coalition. So you need a political coalition, stage one, before the election. You then need a governing coalition, stage two. If you can have a solid political and social coalition as part of the conversation about a governing coalition, you will have solved half the problems. And that is how we view the approach strategically to coalition building.
I agree. I think having lived in the Netherlands for 4 years, a country that prides itself on the quality of its coalitions, what you always see is that the informal and the bringing the different stakeholders play such an important role. And what that means is that by the time the governing coalition is in place, they've already got and garnered enough of a broad consensus that the compromises that they make are always not in line with the party ideals, but what is in line with what is best for the citizens. And that's how a country can function in a coalition sense and function well. Um, but I want to move us from the theoretical, how we were going to approach things, to the practical, and talk about who potential coalition partners could be for Rise Mzansi. So let's start with the big one. Are you considering a coalition with the ANC post 2024?
Okay, so let me maybe talk about the goals first, right? Before we get to the who. I believe that the ANC has lost the capacity to govern, and it also doesn't have the capacity to govern in a coalition. They're not used to it. And I think the only way a coalition would work for them is if it is a weaker party, one, or secondly, if it is a kindred spirit party. And by kindred spirit, I don't even mean in the ideological sense. I mean in the sense that you kind of need to be a corrupted and corruptible institution to successfully go into a coalition with the ANC, because it has become a patronage center, right? So that is an obstacle as well. Secondly, I also think that a coalition that involves the EFF, whether it is the ANC and the EFF or the EFF and somebody else, tends to be very unstable. Okay, because firstly, you have a lot of these parties coming together, and at the slightest hint of what people don't like, well, you threaten to collapse the whole thing. Like, we're gonna go for Trump and his whiteness, and you can't have that nonsense in a national government. Unfortunately, coalitions are difficult. You have to be in the same room and co-govern with people you don't like. And so I think even in the context of the ANC itself, I think there are lots of people in the ANC who are nervous about the tail wagging that dog. That leaves us with the ideal scenario. So let me answer the question this way. Ideally, you want a coalition that excludes the ANC and the EFF in that equation. That's the ideal. That really is the idea. For the reason that you want a fresh start, the EFF is an externalized faction of the ANC. So you want a fresh start. You want fresh thinking. You want a new way of conceiving, in the way that we've been discussing, a new way of conceiving and formulating solutions to problems, or understanding problems, and so on. So just, even if they were not bad, you also want that fresh start. The question is whether the Democratic Alliance, which has got a track record of governing a province, it's got a track record of governing a metro, at least one metro. It's got a difficult track record recent track record of being in a coalition, but they've got an experience of governing. Whether between themselves and, say, Action SA and the Inkatha Freedom Party, it is possible to fashion, and we would count ourselves in that equation, to fashion a more stable coalition that is unencumbered by the kind of historical and other problems that we talk about, so that the cleanup of the state can begin in earnest. And if you have a situation where you have built that pre-election coalition and you've got many stakeholders behind the idea, and in the research that you guys have done, you would have seen that people are not averse to the idea of coalitions, right? But they're very unhappy about the behavior of the parties in coalitions.
Certainly so.
Right? So I think, in other words, can you get 3 or 4 political parties that are actually quite mature about what needs to happen and how you approach problems, that are acting in good faith? And I think that's prize one. Anything else, Gabriel, is a lottery, I must tell you. I wish I could give you more straight answers, but it's a lottery.
So I think to go into to talk about this a little bit more, you and to give the viewers kind of a sense, some of the research that you're talking about is that South Africans are, to use a crass term, gatvol of the amount the government mismanagement, the terrible outcomes we've been seeing, and as you pointed out, people are incredibly open to the idea of a coalition, and even when they are asked twofold question, so are you open to coalition, a grand coalition, people will say, opposition voters will say, hell yes. And then they say, and then you ask all voters, would you want your party to join a coalition? Would you be happy for them to join a coalition? Still, the majority of people, even voters in the ANC, who will say, yes, we want our party to join a coalition. So the time is right for coalition politics, and the sentiment is there. And I think this is important. And so to kind of wrap up our talking of about coalitions, you are saying that it's a broad scale coalition of the current opposition, principled opposition would be the ideal, and anything else involving the ANC or the EFF, it's going to be a toss up to see whether or not this country can survive 5 more years of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I want to end then with a last question, related to voting in 2024. So, why should South African voters choose Rise Mzansi in the 2024 elections?
Simple. They get to build the democracy and the prosperity that they've been wanting to enjoy. And they get to build it themselves, because our approach is bottom up, it is multidisciplinary, it is collaborative, it is community based to the greatest extent that you can do that, understanding that you need national systems in order to make these things work. And it also helps to have hope in ourselves rather than hope in the transaction of politics, which is somebody is going to do this for me, to saying, I have a good shot at unity with other South Africans to create the country that we've always dreamed of. If I'm fed up with politics, this is the moment of renewal, and I'm going to do it together with people I know. We've got something called the power of 8, which is every person recruits 8 people they know. So your activism doesn't have to be difficult and so on. You don't have to go and stand on a street corner. Just WhatsApp 8 people you know, and you form a micro conversation, and you join other people who are doing the same. Because democracy is not supposed to be a hassle. Right? Democratic participation. And so we are making our effort as participative and as decentralized as possible, while being united by common values and common priorities.
Well, thank you so much, Songezo, for taking the time to speak to me today. It has been incredibly fascinating and an incredibly hopeful conversation to see that not only are you promising to bring a new paradigm to politics, but you have it clearly comes from a well thought out, well researched, and a principled and hopeful place. And I can only hope and wish you the best as we run up to the 2024 elections.
Thanks very much, Gabriel. Much appreciated.
Thank you.